Dust bowls and black blizzards. What was the cause of the Dust Bowl? What impact did the Dust Bowl have upon citizens? What type of relief were provided for victims of the Dust Bowl? Nature, meanwhile, had been providing some unplanned scarcity. Late in 1933, a prolonged drought struck the states of the Trans-Mississippi Great Plains. Rainless weeks were followed by furious, whiny winds. While the sun was darkened by millions of tons of powdery topsoil torn from homesteads in an area that stretched from eastern Colorado to western Missouri, soon to be dubbed the Dust Bowl. Despondent citizens sat on front porches with protective masks on their faces, watching their farms swirl. A 7-year-old boy in Kansas suffocated. Overwrought victims of the Dust Bowl disaster predicted that by the end of the world or the second coming of Christ. So you're getting not only a drought, but you're also getting just whiny winds that are plaguing the Great Mississippi. Of course, this is terrible for the crops, looking at unplanned scarcity, but as well as the conditions of the Dust Bowl were very hazardous. Drought and wind triggered the dust storms, but they were not the only culprits. The human hand also worked in its mischief. High grain prices during World War II had enticed farmers to bring countless acres of marginal land under cultivation. Worse, dry farming techniques and mechanization had revolutionized Great Plains agriculture. The steam tractor and the disc plow tore up indefinitely more sod than a team of oxen ever could, leaving the powdery topsoil to be swept away at nature's whim. So you could blame the humans as a result of mechanization as much as you can nature for these conditions. Burned and blown out of the Dust Bowl, tens of thousands of refugees fled their ruined acres. In 5 years, about 350,000 Oklahomans and Arkansans, Okies and Arkies, trekked to Southern California in junkyards on wheels. Undeterred by signs saying keep out, many found a new home in the San Joaquin Valley, which shared much in common with the Southern Plains. Arid climate, cotton growing, newfound oil deposits, and abundant land. Yet the transition was cruel. Food, shelter, and clothing were scarce. The winter months without work and heat proved nearly unendurable for the migrants. The dismal story of these human tumbleweeds was realistically portrayed in John Steinbeck's best-selling novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which proved to be the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the Dust Bowl. So, in order to deal with these terrible conditions, a lot of people are, of course, moving to Southern California. We call these people Okies and Arkies, and food, shelter, and clothing were definitely scarce, which makes it very difficult to make that transition. Zealous New Dealers, sympathetic towards the soil tillers, made various others efforts to relieve their burdens. The Fraser-Lemke Farm Bankruptcy Act, passed in 1934, made possible a suspension of mortgage foreclosures for 5 years, but it was voided next year by the Supreme Court. A revised law limiting the grace period to 3 years was unanimously upheld. In 1935, the president set up the Resettlement Administration, charged with the task of removing near farmless farmers to better land. And more than 200 million young trees were successfully planted on bare prairies as windbreaks by the young men of the Civilian Conservation Corps, even though the one governor adhered to trying to grow hair on a bald head. So as you can see through this paragraph, you want to see some of the things that the government's trying to do in terms of helping with the Dust Bowl. Native Americans also felt the far-reaching hand of New Deal reform. Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Coyer ardently sought to reverse the forced assimilation policies in place since the Dawes Act of '87. Inspired by sojourn among the Pueblo Indians in Taos, New Mexico, Coyer promoted the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also called the Indian New Deal. The new law encouraged tribes to establish local self-government and to preserve their native crafts and traditions. The act also helped to stop the loss of Indian lands and reverse tribes' interest in their identity and culture. Yet not all Indians applauded it. Some denounced the legislation as back to the blanket measure, that sought to make museum pieces out of Native Americans. 77 tribes refused to organize under his provisions, though nearly 200 others did establish tribal governments. So what we're also getting is we're getting the Dawes Act, which remember would be government confiscation of land that would then be sold. That's ending. We're getting a New Deal of for Indians in 1934, the Indian New Deal, which is looking to reorganize and establish self-government powers. Some Native Americans were against this because they saw that as them being portrayed more as a museum exhibit than rather given sovereignty. So we did answer this, 14 through 16. So just go back and make sure, listen to that last section. Battling bankers and business. Why was there a need for Security and Exchange Commission? Battling bankers and big business. Reformist New Dealers were determined from the outset to curb the money changers, who had played fast and loose with global investors before the Wall Street crash of '29. The 100 Days of Congress passed the Truth in Securities Act, which required promoters to transmit to investors sworn information regarding the soundness of their stocks and bonds. An old saying was thus reversed to read, "Let the seller beware, although the buyer might never read the fine print." In 1934, Congress took further step to protect the public against fraud, deception, and inside manipulation. It authorized the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC, which is designed as a watchdog administration agency. Stock markets, henceforth, were to operate more as trading marts and less as gambling casinos. New dealers likewise directed their fire at public utility holding companies, those super corporations. Citizens had seen one of these incredible colossi collapse during the spring of 1932, when Chicago and Samuel Insull's multi-billion-dollar financial empire crashed. Possibilities of controlling within a minimum capital, a half dozen or so pyramided layers of big business suggested to Roosevelt a 96-inch dog being wagged by a 4-inch tail. The Public Utility Holding Company Act of 35 finally delivered a death sentence to this type of bloated growth, except where it might be deemed economically needful. So what we end up getting here is, of course, during the Great Depression, is stockholders weren't necessarily, or companies, very rich and wealthy companies, weren't necessarily providing the information to their stockholders on where their stocks, the worth of their stocks. So in order to prevent that, they passed the Truth in Securities Act, which required promoters to transmit to investors sworn information regarding how well their stocks and bonds are doing. Right, so let the seller beware. That's what they mean, right? That was an old saying, right? That it reversed it. Right now, what they're saying is you need to make sure that you're letting the stock holders know how well or how bad the company's doing. They also established the SEC, which is designed as a watchdog administrative agency to watch the stocks and to operate more as trading markets and less as gambling casinos. So just to kind of keep an eye, just make sure that the stock market, that there's no fraud that's going on or no deception or inside manipulation where you're getting someone that knows what's going on and kind of shifting the stocks to favor them individually. Yeah. So we went over that. Why was there a need for Security and Exchange Commission? Just because to prevent the corruption and dishonesty of the stock market that existed during the Great Depression or prior to the Great Depression. What was a TVA and what were the successes of the TVA? The TVA, harnesses, and the Tennessee. Inevitably, the sprawling electric power company attracted the fire of the New Deal reformers. Within a few decades, it had risen nothingness to be home with an investment of $13 billion. As a public utility, it reached directly and regularly in the pocketbooks of millions of consumers for vitally needed services. Ardent New Dealers accused it of gouging the public with excessive rates, especially since it owed much of its success to having secured, often for a song, priceless water power sites for the public domain. The tempestuous Tennessee River provided New Dealers with a rare opportunity. With its tributaries, the river drained a badly eroded area about the size of England, and one containing 2.5 million of the most poverty-stricken people in America. The federal government already owned valuable properties at Muscle Shoals, which had erected plants for needed nitrates in World War I. By developing the hydroelectric potential of the entire area, Washington could combine the immediate advantage of putting thousands of people to work in a long-term project for reforming the power monopoly. An act creating the Tennessee Valley Authority Association, which was passed in 1933 by the 100 Days Congress. This far-ranging enterprise was largely a result of the steadfast vision and unflagging zeal of Senator George W. Norris of Nebraska, after whom one of the mighty dams is named. From the standpoint of planned economy, the TVA was by far the most revolutionary of all New Deal schemes. This new agency was determined to discover precisely how much the production and distribution of electricity costs, so that a yardstick could set up to the test the fairness of rates charged by private companies. Utility corporations lashed back at this entering wedge of a government control, charging that the low cost of the TVA power was due to dishonest bookkeeping and the absence of taxes. Critics complained that the whole dream was creeping socialism in concrete. But the New Dealers, shrugging off such outcries, pointed a prideful finger at the amazing achievements of the TVA. The gigantic project brought to the area not only full employment and the blessings of cheap electric power, but low-cost housing, abundant cheap nitrates, the restoration of eroded soil, reforestation, improved navigation, and flood control. Rivers ran blue instead of brown, and the once poverty-cursed area was being transformed into one of the most flourishing regions in the United States. So a couple things that we want to understand. These last few paragraphs that talked about TVA. This is probably the most successful, the Tennessee Valley Authority, one of the most successful components in the New Deal. And the reason why what this did is it brought cheap electric power, full employment, low cost housing, and just overall better conditions in the Tennessee Valley. Prior to this, of course, electric was was privatized, and they were just charging just excessive rates, which was not necessarily helpful for people that were living in poverty and that were struck by the Great Depression. So this went ahead, and of course, this created jobs by establishing public works, but it also lowered rates for electricity. In turn, this also led to better conditions for housing as well as environmental conditions. Foreigners were greatly impressed with the possibilities of similar schemes in their own lands, and exulting New Dealers agitated for parallel enterprises in the valleys of Columbia, Colorado, and Missouri rivers. Federally built dams, one would span all these waterways and pound more than 30% of the total annual runoff from the roof of America and the Rocky Mountains. Hydroelectric power from those dams would drive the growth of the urban West. The waters they diverted would nurture agriculture, previously bone-dry western deserts. But conservative reaction with the socialistic New Deal would confine TVA's brand of guided resource management and comprehensive regional development of the Tennessee Valley. So we definitely did answer what was the TVA and as well as what was the success of the TVA. I'm not going to go through it again because I'm confident we hit that. Housing and Social Security. Many argue that the SSA was one of the greatest victories of the New Deal, provide evidence, and also just things that contradict that evidence. Housing and Social Security. The New Deal had meanwhile framed sturdy new policies for housing and construction. To speed recovery and better homes, Roosevelt set up the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, as early as 1934. The building industry was to be stimulated by small loans to householders, both for improving their dwellings and completing new ones. So popular did FHA prove to be what is one of the few alphabetical agencies to outlast the age of Roosevelt. So this is saying is one of the things the Housing Administration would continue after Roosevelt's administration. Congress bolstered the program in 1937 by authorizing the United States Housing Authority, the USHA, an agency designed to lend money to states or communities for low-cost construction. Although units for about 650,000 low-income people were started, new building fell tragically short of needs. New deal efforts to expand the project collided with brick wall opposition from real estate promoters, builders, and landlords, to say nothing of anti-New Dealers who attacked what they considered down the rat hole spending. Nonetheless, for the first time in a century, the slum areas in America ceased growing and even shrank. So you're getting public housing that's being created. Of course, you're getting some anti-New Dealers that are for private, that are more privatized. They're against this because it's competition for them. And this did go ahead, and it went ahead and it decreased the amount of homelessness that existed during the Great Depression. Incomparably more important was the success of New Dealers in the field of unemployment insurance and old age pensions. The greatest victory was the epical Social Security Act of 1935, one of the most complicated and far-reaching laws ever to pass Congress. To cushion future depressions, the measure provided for federal, state unemployment insurance, to provide security for old age, specified categories of retired workers to receive regular payments from Washington. These payments range from $10 to $85 a month, raised periodically. They were financed by a payroll tax on both employers and employees. Provision also made for the blind, the physically handicapped, and delinquent children, and other dependents. So we're getting here is the Social Security Act of 1935. What this act is doing is it's providing just economic assistance to those that would be of older age, right? And it's usually taken out of the tax from payroll, right? Social Security, of course, still exists today. Republican opposition to the sweeping new legislation was bitter. Social Security, insisted Hoover, must be bullied upon a cult of work, not a cult of leisure. The GOP national chairman falsely charged that every worker would have to wear a metal dog tag for life. Social Security was largely inspired by the example of the more highly industrialized nations of Europe. In the agricultural America of an earlier day, there had always been farm chores for all ages. A large family had cared for its own dependents. But in an urbanized economy, at the mercy of boom or bust cycles, the government was now recognizing its responsibility for the welfare of its citizen. By 1939, over 45 billion people were eligible for Social Security benefits. In subsequent years, further categories were added, including blatantly farm and domestic workers. For decades, millions of poor men and women were excluded from Social Security. In contrast to Europe, where welfare programs were generally universal, American workers had to be employed in certain kinds of jobs to get coverage. So what we're getting here is Republicans, of course, are at this time, they're against this new idea of Social Security. They felt that, they still have that Hoover mentality of that these benefits should be earned rather than provided by the government, right? That rugged individualist mentality that exists. This paragraph right here kind of just discusses how Social Security, that this was nothing that was rare. In fact, most industrialized nations had this in Europe because they recognize just the wear and tear in terms of industrialization, and that the government needs to be responsible for the well-being of the people. So let's go through this. Many argued that the Social Security Act was one of the greatest victories of the New Deal, provide evidence and support to contradict this statement. So when we're looking at the Social Security Act, some of the supporting evidence is that, of course, due to industrialization, that the population, the elderly population, they needed this support, right? That you no longer lived in farms where you're getting large families that are able to assist one another. Contradicting evidence would be the Republican Party when they're saying that this is it's not up for the government to take care of the individuals, rather it's the rugged individuals that exist where people should be self-reliant. A New Deal for labor. What did the Wagner Act create? What was the Fair Labor Standards Act? A New Deal for labor. The NRA Blue Eagles, with their call for collective bargaining, had been a godsend for organized labor. As New Deal expenditures brought some slackening of unemployment, labor began to feel more secure and hence more self-assertive. A rash of walkouts occurred in the summer of 1934, including a paralyzing general strike in San Francisco, which was broken only when outraged citizens resorted to vigilante tactics. When the Supreme Court acts a Blue Eagle, a Congress sympathetic to labor unions undertook to fill the vacuum. The fruit of its deliberations was the National Labor Act of 1935, more commonly known as the Wagner Act, after its congressional sponsor, New York Senator Robert F. Wagner. This trailblazing law created a powerful new National Labor Relations Board for administrative purposes and reasserted the right of labor to engage in self-organization and to bargain collectively through representatives of its own choice, considered the Magna Carta of American labor. The Wagner Act provided to be a major milestone for American workers. So, of course, remember, we're getting the NRA, the Blue Eagles, not the NRA, not the National Rifle Association, right? We're getting the NRA that's more for labor relations, right? That it was ruled unconstitutional because they felt as if that it was the executive branch, that it was President Roosevelt that was kind of spurring the NRA's actions. They saw this as unconstitutional because Congress kind of gave they said that Congress can't give the president to do the power to do that. So what Congress goes ahead and they create what we call the Wagner Act to deal just to make sure that labor is still getting the progress needed during this time. So what the National Relations Act does is this law protected the right of labor to organize in unions and bargain collectively, right? It's basically saying that the right to form a union is protected. Under the encouragement of highly sympathetic National Labor Relations Board, a host of unskilled workers began to organize themselves into effective unions. The leader of this drive was a beetle-browed, domineering, and melodramatic John L. Lewis, boss of the United Mine Workers. In 1935, he succeeded in forming the Committee for Industrial Organization, the CIO, within the ranks of the skilled craft American Federation of Labor, but skilled workers, ever since the days of the ill-fated Knights of Labor in the 1880s, had shown only lukewarm sympathy for the cause of unskilled labor, especially blacks. In 1936, the following inevitable friction with the CIO, the older federation suspended the upstart union's association with newer organization. Undaunted, the rebellious CIO moved on a concerted scale into the huge automobile industry. Late in 1936, the workers resorted to a revolutionary technique known as a sit-down strike. They refused to leave the factory building of the General Motors at Flint, Michigan, and thus prevented the importation of strike breakers. Conservative respecters of private property were scandalized. The CIO finally won a resounding victory when its union, after heated negotiations, was recognized by the General Motors as the sole bargaining agency of its employees. Unskilled workers now pressed their advantage. The United States Steel Company, hitherto an impossible nut for labor to crack, averted a costly strike when it voluntarily granted rights of unionization to its CIO employees. But little steel companies fought back savagely. Citizens were shocked in 1937 by the Memorial Day massacre at the Plant Republic Steel Company in South Chicago. In a bloody fracas, police fired upon pickets and workers, leaving the area strewn with several score dead and wounded. So what you're getting in these few paragraphs, I would say, is a continuity, but yet a change. You're getting the Wagner Act, right, which is kind of politically a change, saying that's legalizing the right to collectively bargain and organize, right? You are getting also a change just in terms of the strategy with these sit-in strikes, right? However, a continuity would be just the from the progressive era would, of course, be you could bring up the Chicago strike in 1937, where you're getting police fired upon pickets and workers. I mean, you're still getting the violence amongst unions, and I guess you could say local government. A change that you could bring up would be the Fair Labor Standards Act. A better deal for labor continued when Congress, in 1938, passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. And what this act does is it regulated minimum wages and maximum hours for workers involved in the interstate commerce. The law also outlawed labor by children under 16, right? The exclusion of agricultural service and domestic workers meant that many blacks, Mexican, and women who work concentrating sectors did not benefit from the act's protection. So there's some pros and cons here. So industries involved in the interstate commerce were to set up a minimum wage and maximum hour levels. The eventual goals were 40 cents an hour, later raised, and a 40-hour work week. Later, labor, children under 18, if the occupation was dangerous, was forbidden. These reforms were bitterly, though futilely opposed by many industrialists, especially by the southern textile factories who had profited from low-wage labor. But the exclusion of agricultural service and domestic workers meant that blacks, Americans, and women who were concentrating in these fields did not benefit from the act. So, was it fair? To a certain extent. Was there change? Yes, you are getting change in the extent that it's establishing minimum wage and also child labor laws to a very certain extent. In the later New Deal days, labor unionization thrived. Roosevelt wants you to join a union was rallying outcry professional organizers. The president received valuable support at the ballot box from labor leaders and many appreciative working people. One mill worker remarked that Roosevelt was the only man we ever had in the White House who knew that my boss is a SOB. So, of course, we could see a change from the Hoover administration as well as the Harding administration, and I guess you could throw Coolidge in there, is that labor unions are definitely progressing and workers are getting more rights through the acts that are passed. The CIO surged forward, breaking completely with the AFL in 1938. One occasion, the Committee for Industrial Organization was formally reconstituted as the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Under the new visionary, though high-handed presidency of John L. Lewis, by 1940, the CIO could claim about 4 million members in its constituent unions, including some 200,000 blacks. Nevertheless, the bitter and annoying jurisdictional feuding involving strikes continued with the AFL. At times, labor seemed more bent solely on costly civil war than its age-old war with management. So we definitely did answer those two. Landon challenges the champ, discuss the outcome of the election of 1836. I'm actually going to skip that section just for the sake of time. So let's go to a very important. What did the 20th Amendment provide? 9 old men on the bench. Bowing his head to sleety blast, Roosevelt took the presidential oath on January 20, 1937. Instead of the traditional March 4th, the 20th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified in 1933. It swept away the post-election lame duck session of Congress and shortened by 6 weeks the awkward period before inauguration. So that's what basically the 20th Amendment is doing. It's taking away that post-election lame duck session of Congress. So it's shortening the amount of time between the old and the new president takes office. Flushed with victory, Roosevelt interpreted his re-election as a mandate to continue New Deal reforms. But in his eyes, the cloistered old men on the Supreme Court, like fossilized stumbling blocks, stood stubbornly in the pathway of progress. In 9 major cases involving the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration had been thwarted 7 times. The court was ultra-conservative, and 6 of the 9 oldsters in black were over 70. As luck would have it, not a single member had been appointed by FDR in his first term. So you're getting a liberal Congress, also getting a very liberal president, and then a very conservative Supreme Court. Roosevelt, his Dutch-up, viewed the mounting impatience, what he regarded as the obstructive conservatism of the court. Some of these old guard appointees were hanging up with a senile grip, partly because they felt it was their patriotic duty to curb socialistic tendencies of that radical in the White House. Roosevelt believed that the voters in 3 successive elections, the presidential elections of 32 and 36, and the midterm congressional elections of 34, had returned a smashing verdict in favor of the program of reform. Democracy, in his view, meant rule by people. If the American way of life was to be preserved, Roosevelt argued, the Supreme Court ought to get in line with the Supreme Court of public opinion. So Roosevelt's saying is if we want rule by the people, well, the Supreme Court should rule by the people rather than some of their bias. Roosevelt finally hit upon a court scheme that he regarded as the answer to Maiden's prayer. In fact, it proved to be one of the most costly political misjudgments of his career. When he sprang his brainstorm on a shocked nation early in 1937, he caught the country and Congress completely by surprise. Roosevelt bluntly asked Congress for legislation to permit him to add a new justice to the Supreme Court for every member over 70 who would not retire. The maximum membership could then be 15. Roosevelt pointed out the necessity of injecting vigorous new blood for the court. He alleged was far behind in his work. This charge, which turned out to be false, brought heated accusations of dishonesty. At best, Roosevelt was headstrong and not fully aware of the fact that the court, in popular thinking, had become something of a sacred cow. So what Roosevelt is trying to do is he wants to add, for every member, he wants to add more members of the Supreme Court. So, of course, it would favor his presidency, right? He feels that this court is too conservative. The court changes course. The court changes course. Discuss the criticism of FDR's court packing plan. Congress and the nation were promptly convulsed over Roosevelt's court packing plan to expand the court. And once again, I talked about this. This is his politically motivated, ill-fated scheme to add a new justice to the Supreme Court for every member over 70. So for everyone over 70, which was the majority of them, I think it might have been all of them, he wanted to add a new member. Of course, that this is going to go ahead and help him be able to gain more support because, remember, the Supreme Court is very conservative. Franklin, double-crossing Roosevelt, was vilified for attempting to break down the delicate checks and balances among the three branches of the government. He was accused of grooming himself as a dictator by trying to browbeat the judiciary. In the eyes of the countless citizens, most Republicans, but including Democrats, basic liberties seemed to be in jeopardy. God bless the Supreme Court was a fervent prayer. So they saw this as that he's trying to break down the checks and balances. Remember, it is a president that goes ahead and sets the Supreme Court appointees. So Roosevelt is going to add just more members of the Supreme Court, then this obviously means that this is problematic because, of course, he will select members that tend to favor more of his policies. The court had, meanwhile, seen the axe hanging over its head. Whatever his motives, Justice Roberts, formerly regarded as a conservative, began to vote on the side of his liberal colleagues. A switch in time saves nine was a classic criticism inspired by this ideological change. By a 5-4 decision, the court in March 37 upheld the principle of a state minimum wage for women, thereby reversing its stand on a different case earlier. In succeeding decisions, a court more sympathetic to the New Deal upheld the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act. Roosevelt's court packing plan was further undermined when Congress voted full pay for justices over 70 who retired. Whereupon one of the oldest conservative members resigned to be replaced by New Dealer, Justice Hugo Black. So what we start to see is you start to see one of the conservative judges tend to shift to more liberal views. Some of the New Deal legislation that we talked about, they are ruled constitutional. So we're starting to see some changes within the Supreme Court that existed after FDR's court packing criticism. Another thing that you start to know happens is Congress passes a new act, right, which says that if you're over 70 and you retire and you're part of the Supreme Court, you will still get paid full benefits. As a result of this, one of the conservative judges retires, and then you're getting Hugo Black, a New Dealer, is part of the Supreme Court. Congress finally passed a court reform bill, but this watered-down version applied only to lower courts. Roosevelt, the master politician, thus suffered his first major legislative defeat at the hands of his own party in Congress. Americans have never viewed lightly a president tampering with the Supreme Court, no matter how popular his chief executive may be. Yet in his losing battle, Roosevelt instantly won his campaign. The court, as he had hoped, became markedly more friendly to New Deal programs. Furthermore, a succession of deaths and resignations enabled him to make 9 appointments to the tribunal, more than any of his predecessors since George Washington. The clock unpacked the court. So although his court packing scheme did not necessarily pass Congress, right, it did go to his favor. The Supreme Court did become more accepting of New Deal policies. Some of those judges did resign. Some of them would pass away. So it allowed the New Deal to be more constitutional, quote unquote. Yet incensed, FDR lost the court battle and the war. He so aroused conservatives of both parties in Congress, and New Deal reforms were passed after 1970, after 37, the year of the fight to pack the bench. With his catastrophic miscalculation, he squandered much of the political goodwill that had carried him to such a resounding victory in the 36 election. But remember, of course, politically, he's criticized for this. Both Democrats and Republicans never really like when a president tampers with the Supreme Court. Twilight of the New Deal. Describe the Keynesian economic theory. How does the Keynesian theory relate to FDR's program and philosophies? Roosevelt's first term, from 33 to 37, did not banish the Depression from the land employment. Let me try that again. Roosevelt's first term, from 33 to 37, did not banish the Depression from the land. Unemployment stubbornly persisted in 1936 at about 15%, down from the grim 25% of 1933, but it was still miserably high. Despite the inventiveness of the New Deal programs and the billions of dollars in pump priming, recovery had been dishearteningly modest, though the country seemed to be inching its way back to economic wealth. Then in 1937, the economy took a sharp downturn, surprisingly severe depression within depression that the president's critics quickly dubbed the Roosevelt recession. In fact, government policies had caused a nosedive as new Social Security taxes began to bite into payrolls, and the administration cut back on spending out of continuing reverence from the orthodox economic doctrine of the balanced budget. So what we end up getting in 37 is we do get a recession. So think about this as a depression within a depression. And one of the reasons why, according to historians, is because you're getting the Social Security taxes that are, of course, taking away from people's paychecks, right? And one of the things that they also want to do is looking at a balanced budget, right? That the government's doing a lot of spending, and they're more cognizant of this. Only at this date did Roosevelt at last frankly and deliberately embrace the recommendations of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. The New Deal had run deficits for several years, but all of them had been rather small and none was intended. Now, in April of 37, Roosevelt announced a bold program to stimulate the economy by planned deficit spending. Although the deficits were still undersized for the Herculean task of conquering the Depression, this abrupt policy reversal marked a major turning point in the government's relation to the economy. Keynesianism, the use of government spending and fiscal policy to prime the pump of the economy and encourage consumer spending, became the new economic orthodoxy and remained so for decades. So let me just go over this. I'm going to read this definition and explain it to you guys. It was an economic theory based on the thoughts of British economist John Maynard Keynes, holding that central banks should adjust interest rates and governments should use deficit spending and tax policies to increase purchasing power and hence prosperity. So what this is saying is this is okay. It's all right for the government to get into debt. If the government's getting into debt, as long as it is encouraging consumer spending to stimulate the economy, right? Yeah. So I mean, remember they're concerned about the deficit. America prior to this was a creditor nation, but Keynesian economics say, hey, it's okay to establish policies that's going to encourage spending, right? That's okay to get into debt as long as it's encourage government spending of the consumer. Roosevelt had meanwhile been pushing the remaining reform measures in the New Deal. Early in 37, he urged a Congress growing more conservative, to authorize sweeping reorganization of national administration in the interest of streamlined efficiency. But the issue became tangled when presumed autocratic ambitions in regard to the Supreme Court, and he suffered another stinging defeat. 2 years later, in 39, Congress partially relented, and in the Reorganization Act gave limited powers for administrative reforms, including the key new executive office in the White House. The New Dealers were accused of having the richest campaign chest in history, and in truth, government relief checks had a curious habit of coming in bunches just before ballot time. To remedy such practices, Congress adopted the much heralded Hatch Act of 1939. This act barred federal administrative officials, except the highest policy-making officers, from active political campaigning and soliciting. It also forbade the use of government funds for political purposes, as well as a collection of campaign contributions from people receiving relief payments. The Hacked Act was brought in the 1940s to place limits on campaign contributions and expenditures. But such clever ways of getting around it were found that the whole legislation proved disappointing. So we're getting during this time ways to limit donations and as well as campaign contributions. By 1938, the New Deal had clearly lost much of its momentum. Magician Roosevelt could find few dazzling new reform habits to pull out of his tall silk hat. In the congressional elections of 1938, the Republicans for the first time got heavily into the New Deal majorities in Congress. Though failing to gain control of either house, the international crisis that came to boil in 38 to 39 shifted public attention away from domestic reform and no doubt helped save the political hide of Roosevelt's spendocracy. The New Deal, for all practical purposes, had shot its bolt. So by 38, you're seeing the New Deal almost coming to an end. So let's look at this question. Describe the Keynesian economic theory. Let's go through this. So John Maynard Keynes, of course, he rose to his international prominence in the 20s. One of the things that he argues is that the government should intervene in times of recession by boosting aggregate demand through deficit spending. So he's saying in times it's okay for the government to get into debt and spend, right, if it means that the consumers are going to go ahead and stimulate the economy. This definitely relates to Roosevelt's New Deal because that's what that's what he's doing, right? He wants to create programs that provide economic resources for Americans, so therefore they could go ahead and stimulate and spend in the economy, right? New Deal or Raw Deal, our last section. What were some of the criticisms of the New Deal? How did New Dealers defend their record? Foes of the New Deal condemned its alleged waste, incompetence, confusion, contradictions, and cross purposes, as well as the Schisel and graft and alphabetical agencies, alphabet soup as they called it, sneered Al Smith. Roosevelt had done nothing, cynics said, that an earthquake could have done better. Critics deplored the employment of crackpot of college professors, leftist pinkos, and outright communists. Such observers, it was charged, were trying to make America over in the Bolshevik Marxist image under Revoltsky, the Hearst newspapers lambasted. So one of the things that you understand here is that there's a lot of criticism by conservatives saying that the New Deal did nothing. That was very socialist, communist, and Marxist. They're saying that a lot of it was a waste of money. Is a lot of the agencies kind of double dipped, and it made government too large. Roosevelt was further accused by conservatives of being Jewish and of tapping too many bright Jewish leftists for his drain trust. Hard-headed business people who had met a payroll were shocked by the leap before you look. Try anything in one spirit of Roosevelt, the jolly improviser. They accused him of confusing noise and movement with progress. Others appreciated the president's do-something approach. Humorist Will Rogers, the rope-twiggling poet laureate of the era, remarked that if Roosevelt were to burn down the Capitol, people would say, well, at least we got a fire started anyhow. So some people actually, they would just appreciate that Roosevelt was doing something versus Hoover's lack of action. But some people felt that his action was not planned, right? He was kind of just passing laws left and right. And remember, Congress was very much in his favor for most of his presidencies. Bureaucratic meddling and regimentation were also bitter complaints of anti-New Dealers. In truth, bureaucracy did blossom. The federal government, with its hundreds and tens of thousands of employees, became incomparably the largest single business in the country as the states faded further in the background. Some people argued that there was too much federal power, too much bureaucracy, that the states' rights were being lost. Promises of budget balancing, to say of other promises, had flown out of the window. So foes of the New Deal pointed out. The national debt had stood at the already enormous figure of 19 trillion. In 1932, it had skyrocketed to 40 billion by 1939. Sorry, I'm reading through this. It's either trillion or billion. America was becoming, its critics America was becoming, its critics charged, a handout state, trying to squander itself into prosperity. U.S. stood for unlimited spending. Such lavish benefications were undermining the old virtues of thrift and initiative. Ordinary Americans, once self-reliant citizens, were getting a bad case of the gimmies. Their wishbones were becoming larger than their backbones. In the 19th century, hard-pressed workers went west. Now they want on relief. So what we're looking here is there's a shift in American identity, according to some conservatives, that we're becoming a handout nation during this time. That people went west for hard work and for looking to start something for themselves. But now what we're getting is they're going west for relief. Business was bitter, accusing the New Deal of fomenting class strife. Conservatives insisted the labor and the farmer, especially the big operator, were being pampered. Why so successful? Countless business people, especially Republicans, declared that they could pull themselves out of depression if they can only get the federal government and interventionist big government off their backs. Private enterprise, they charged, was being stifled by planned economy, planned bankruptcy, creeping socialism, and the philosophy Washington could do better. With a federal pill for every ill, states' rights were being ignored, while the government was competing in business with its own citizens under a dictatorship of do-gooders. So big businesses are saying, hey, we could get ourselves out of this depression. States are saying we could get ourselves out of this depression. But Roosevelt's doing too much, and he's regulating us too much, where we can't do anything. The aggressive leadership of Roosevelt, the one-man super government, also came in for denunciation. Heavy fire was especially directed in his attempts to browbeat the Supreme Court and create a dummy Congress. Roosevelt had even tried in 38 elections with backfiring results to purge Democratic members of Congress who did not march in lockstep by supporting the primary challenges. 3 senators who he publicly opposed were all triumphantly reelected. So they're saying that Roosevelt did too much to control the Supreme Court as well as Congress. The most damning indictment of the new DOs that failed to cure the depression. Afloat in the sea of red ink, some argued, had merely administered aspirin and sedative and band-aids. Many economists came to believe that better results would have been achieved by much greater deficit spending, despite some $20 billion poured out in 6 years of deficit spending and lending, of leaf raking and pump and priming. The gap was not closed between production and consumption. There were even more mountainous farm surpluses under Roosevelt than under Hoover. Millions of dispirited men and women were still unemployed in 1939. After 6 years of drain, strain, and pain, not until World War II blazed forth in Europe was unemployment headache solved. So many people that provided relief, or many critics would say that this provided relief, but not relief and some reform, but not necessarily recovery. Therefore, not being successful. And I believe we did answer these 28 and 29. Some New Dealers defend a record, of course, saying about that relief and reform were given. I mean, you could talk about labor unions were given rights, people were given jobs, right? However, they were also saying that perhaps if we were given more resources, we could have even done more, right? All right, and that is it for the New Deal.